Mr. Bison flips!
Mr. Bison flips! Mr. Bison flips! Mr. Bison flips!
Welcome to this quick lesson providing an overview of George Orwell's essay, and I'd have to say his most seminal essay, Politics and the English Language. It was written in 1945, but published in May 1946, so at the same time roughly as Why I Write. So you will see some of the ideas that we touch upon in Why I Write expanded quite significantly in this essay. So the essay essentially explores the relation between writing, thinking, and politics. And Orwell is trying to argue the point that if we write in a slovenly way, our thinking will become sloppy, and thereby we will eventually lose track of things. So he's criticizing bad writing habits because they're spreading by imitation. He's arguing that writers have to rid themselves of bad habits because that will help them to think more clearly about what they're trying to express. And we can see that on page 354 as well, so further on in the essay, where he's saying that the whole tendency of modern prose is away from concrete towards the abstract, because people are trying not to offend or not trying to lock themselves into a corner, and instead, euphemistically more or less, he does talk about all of expression is becoming more of a euphemism. And then he talks about how insincerity is the great enemy of clear language. And he does make that connection between bad prose and oppressive ideologies, and how people who are trying to oppress people use vagueness as one of their weapons, because it's hard to pin them down and say, I disagree with your opinions. From the very start of the essay, the audience has to become complicit in the argument. He forces that upon us in two different ways. One way is that he is directly condescending and accusing in his tone, because he's saying people who bothered with the matter at all, that is the matter of writing and thinking. He's also saying our civilization is decadent and we cannot do anything about it. Any struggle against the abuse is perceived as a sentimental archaism. All of these things forcing us essentially to say, no, they're not archaic. Actually, we should defend language because we care about thinking and we care about what happens in politics. So it's forcing us to be complicit in this way. And to humorously emphasize that archaic nature of speech, he uses a hyperbolic juxtaposition, or two hyperbolic juxtapositions on the first page. He says that fighting for language is like preferring hansom cabs to airplanes or candlelight to electric light, so showing that the world perceives language and thinking as dated. The other thing that forces us into being complicit with his argument is the use of generalizations, which is ironically something he will argue against later on in the essay. But at this early stage, obviously we've had the quote before about how most people who care about the matter at all would admit blah blah blah, and it is generally assumed, and so the argument runs, working on vague assumptions about society as a whole. I think the five central metaphors that really nail down, or similes, that really nail down the argument and really show what Orwell is trying to say, can be represented in these five images. Earlier on in the essay, he talks about how a man who may be driven to drink because he feels himself a failure, and because he's drinking he may fail even more, and thereby showing that the cyclical nature of a relation between thinking and language. So we think sloppily, and thereby our expression becomes poor, which makes us think even less clearly, and then it's a downward spiral forever. He then talks about how politicians particularly use, actually it's not in that context, but implicitly he says that throughout the essay, that language is being used the way a cuttlefish squirts out ink, that we make a vague general statement so that people will forget about what they're actually asking us, and then they can disappear off into the shadows and not have to deal with the questions. Furthermore, he uses the image of people not selecting words carefully anymore, but rather picking stock standard phrases that we can see around us and pulling these together like the walls of a prefabricated henhouse. And again, that metaphor obviously is in Orwell's style simplistic, common, but unique. It's not one that we're used to seeing in print, but it makes perfect sense, and we see how simply phrases can work the way that the walls of a henhouse would work. He then talks about how the vagueness of language falls like soft snow on expression, and thereby we can no longer see the contours of what's trying to be expressed. Thereby we lose track of the central detail, and we just get a general idea of what people are trying to say. And then he, when talking about a Marxist and a propagandist, pamphleteer writing Marxist propaganda, is trying to make a point. His phrases kind of come to him the way that a cavalry horse or cavalry horses respond to the bugle. So the fact that they just come running at him and he doesn't even have to do any thinking. The phrases just come. I'm unhappy, and then bang, here's all these phrases about the proletariat and how it's being the bourgeoisie is suppressing and oppressing, and we need to stand up, brothers and comrades, and whatever. You get the idea. Those stock standard phrases come very easily in certain types of propaganda. Throughout the essay, Orwell achieves verisimilitude by using a very high level of certitudes, very strong verbs, quite a lot of strong modal verbs. So rather than using may and might and could, he uses things like must and will, etc., to show that this is really strong. Two quotes here that illustrate that point. He says, it follows then that any struggle against the abuse of language is a sentimental archaism. That's the one we looked at before. Or now it is clear that the decline of a language must ultimately have political and economic causes. And he's making those assertions fairly strongly, but we are led to question, or we should as critical readers, question whether these are actual truths or if it's kind of syllogism that Orwell is making these assertions. So I should write that word down if it's not familiar to you. And you can look up syllogism if you're not familiar with it. But is he essentially putting two questions together and making a false assumption based on those? Once he's made his point and set up the original thesis, Orwell uses 5 examples of bad, what he perceives as bad writing from the current writing, just to illustrate his point, which sort of gives his essay a pseudo-scientific air in terms of, here's some evidence of what I'm trying to prove, and then he'll go through and analyze those. So the first extract, if you have a look at that in the essay, he's chosen there has 6 negatives, so it's really negating the negation of the negation of the negation, etc., which makes the meaning of the sentences almost impossible to decipher. The second one is mixing metaphors quite extensively, and it's hard to follow along what's going on there. He's playing ducks and drakes with a native battery of idioms, and there's all sorts of weird things in there that doesn't really make sense together. The third statement is just completely meaningless in the fact that it's just got all these taglines on the one side, by definition, such as they are, there is little in. On the other side, is nothing but, is not this, but very little meaning in between those phrases. They're just tag phrases that really drive the argument nowhere. The fourth example is an example of Marxist propaganda, which essentially is what we talked about before with the bugle. It's an accumulation of stale phrases, and ironically it's also not the language of the masses, who the Marxists obviously are trying to appeal to, but rather the sort of stilted party propaganda language that really only some people can access. And in the fifth and final example, he talks about, he uses verbose and convoluted language to talk about a very simple issue, that the language of the BBC is getting too pretentious. But it seems like the language used always says later on that the words and the content seem to have parted and they're not talking about the same thing anymore. Moving into the third section of the essay, so having set up a thesis and then given some examples of how language is used today, he then moves into some of the actual courses and try to identify what the problems actually are. And this is how he expresses that. So straight after those examples, he says, each of these passages has faults of its own. But quite apart from avoidable ugliness, two qualities are common to all of them. The first is staleness of imagery. The other is a lack of precision. The writer either has a meaning and cannot express it, or he inadvertently says something else, or he's almost indifferent as to whether his words mean anything or not. This mixture of vagueness or sheer incompetence is the most marked characteristic of modern English prose, especially of any kind of political writing. As soon as certain topics are raised, the concrete melts into the abstract, and no one seems to be able to think or terms of speech that are not hackneyed. Prose consists less of words chosen for their sake of meaning and more for the phrases tacked together, which is what we talked about in the beginning. I think that idea of staleness is quite interesting and quite a helpful way of thinking of language, that when you're trying to choose expressions for your writing, whenever you go back over your essays and I've written cliche or choose a more effective word, that's generally what it is about. You've used a phrase that's been so used that it's like finding that old bread crust or piece of cheese in the fridge that you don't really want to eat because it's gone stale. So Orwell then carries on and tries to list these specific courses that we should explore and try to avoid.